I'm sitting down to this guy who was approximately the size of a refrigerator, I swear. Like, he was just, I mean, in my memory, this guy was approximately, I don't know, 8'2". Like, he wasn't. But, you know, like, it was the moment of being alone in the room with somebody who was shackled and effectively tied to a chair. And he's in the prison uniform, and he's pissed off at being there.
Welcome to another episode of Bite-Sized Biographies, the podcast of life stories. My name is Corey Thorpe. If you'd like to send in your story or tell your life story, visit bitesizebiographies.com/story. And if you have a friend who enjoys stories, please share this podcast with them. Be sure to listen until the end of the episode for some extra information about this podcast and a promotion for another podcast you might enjoy. Now, on to this episode's conversation. Kate, thank you very much for joining me and for sharing your story. Why don't we just start at the beginning? What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in upstate New York. All over. I have connections all over New York. My parents were 17 when I was born, so I actually attended their high school graduation. And there were periods of time in my very early childhood where we were living in a trailer park or in relatives' homes or homeless or couch surfing. You know, there's different terms for it. And that was okay, I guess. I don't really remember a lot of that. A couple of little flashbulb memories. But life was always fraught and difficult. Because my parents, you know, quite literally, based on the town they were in, were from opposite sides of the tracks. This is in the area of New York where the company Remington Arms is based, like arms like guns. And so both of my mother's parents worked there. They worked in manufacturing, you know, which is sort of, you know, blue collar, very non-glamorous. My father's parents were an accountant and a librarian, and they each owned homes, but there's a difference in the feel of all of it. My father, his family was just socially a couple of steps up. So a lot of drama around that, a lot of drama around different religions coming into play. And it was all, you know, it was Catholics and Protestants, you know, it wasn't like across the world kinds of things. So any memories that I have before I'm about 3 are just tension. And that's about it. When I was 3, we moved. My mother finished her associates in electrical engineering because she basically sat down with her high school guidance counselor with a, hey, I'm pregnant. What 2-year degree can I get to get a stable job? So that's what she did. And we moved down in Endicott, New York, which is sort of along the Pennsylvania border. And she got a job as a programmer. And, you know, a woman programmer in 1980 was not all that common. So good for her. Like, I want credit where credit's due. That she did a lot of things that were very difficult in order to let me be safe and housed and clothed and all of the things. My dad was a stay-home dad for a little while, and then even when he wasn't, he would work like second shift or third shift at different jobs, and so I was around him more, especially during school. And the thing about my dad is he would have these outbursts of anger that were terrifying and never physically hurt me. Well, a couple times, but mostly it was the yelling. Mostly it was the raised voice. It always felt as though the day my parents got married, overnight, my mother turned like 40 and my father stayed 17. And that was it, right? Like, he just stopped developing and she sort of overstepped in terms of the, you know, getting things done in the world. So when I had a bad day, for the most part, I could go to my dad and he would say the right words. But if I needed a school project done or I needed help in some practicalized way, I would go to my mother. So between them, there was like one functional adult.
So what age was this around? When did you move to Endicott?
I was 3. So in time to start nursery school. And then, we moved quite often, even after I was 3, as sort of this succession from crappy apartment to slightly less crappy apartment and so on. And my parents purchased their first house when I was 14. So, it was just sort of that transient feeling in terms of home base, but I always attended the same elementary school and high school. My mother prioritized that, and that's, again, the kind of thing where, she did the things, but unfortunately my mother was never emotionally supportive in any sort of way, and so I was very aware of her resentment. I was very aware of her anger all the time. And hers was not an explosive anger. Hers was a blaming and shaming sort of anger. My father would blow up and get over it. So it wasn't great. My dad was a scary guy when he was angry. But I knew where I stood with him. And with my mother, it was I never knew where I stood. With my father, one example of his anger, though, of how he threw our Christmas tree out in the yard one year because he got frustrated taking the lights off, which, frankly, we can all understand, right?
Yeah.
Another time, I was about 4th grade, and I was a latchkey kid. But at this period of time, I expected him home that afternoon. And I came home from school, and, all the doors were wide open. We lived in a 2nd-floor apartment. And starting from, halfway up the steps, there was this trail of blood. Heavy blood drops. And it led all the way through the house. And I had no idea what to do. There was no note. There was no indication of what was going on here. But apparently, being an idiot, I decided I'm going to research this more, right? Rather than leave. And so I followed this trail of blood, partly because I had 2 much younger sisters. I was 9 when my second sister was born, and 14 when the baby was born. And I didn't know if it was them, maybe. And it turned out that what had happened is my father was actually not home because he was trying to open a window in his bedroom and someone had painted it shut. And he got frustrated, and rather than calling the landlord, getting a razor to break the paint seal, he punched his way through it.
Wow.
Right? And it was that sort of I never cringed my way through the house thinking I'm about to take a fist to the face. But I never knew what was going to set my father off. And I never knew how far it was going to set him off. So it was awkward in many, many ways. There was a particularly difficult year, the year I was 14, about 8th grade. My father had his first heart attack. I was at school, I woke up one morning, both my parents were home, and they were like, your dad's not feeling well. Go to school anyway. We'll figure it out, right? No big deal. Well, this is in the days where you could call 911 and they could do triage over the phone. And they did so, and they told him because he was 30 years old, it was probably just indigestion, go back to bed. And my mother had to call back half an hour later to be like, you need to get an ambulance here right now because I can't carry him and something's wrong. And it turns out, that was his first heart attack.
Wow.
And at the same time, his mother developed cancer for the second time, lung cancer. She had lost half of one of her lungs, in the 70s sometime. But apparently that was not adequate to convince her that perhaps smoking is unhealthy. So she continues to do so. So now it's 1991 or 2, so 20 years later. And now she's got lung cancer again. And she lived in Albany, New York, 2 hours away. And so my mother was taking shifts going up there to drive her to chemo and back. My mother was also pregnant with my youngest sister, who was born with muscular dystrophy. But it took us 14 months to get that diagnosis. All we knew was this is actually a thing. It's called floppy baby syndrome. And she just was failure to thrive, not taking on weight, and not developing muscles, that kind of thing. And they did a muscle biopsy, which is not pleasant at all, especially because she wasn't strong enough to be put under anesthesia for this. And that's when we got a diagnosis of muscular dystrophy. But that's like saying someone has cancer. Like, it doesn't mean anything because there's so many different kinds. And the subtype that my sister has, she was the 100th case ever worldwide.
So very rare.
Super rare. And so the doctor was like, well, we don't really know anything about this diagnosis, but we're pretty sure she's never going to walk or talk. So you should probably put her in a home and forget she was ever born. Like, I still don't know how my mother didn't go over the desk and just kill him. You know?
Yeah, that needs a little bit of bedside manner, I would say. And this was all around 14, 15 for you?
I was 15 when all of this was kind of coming together, 14, all at the same time. So that was a tough year for my family.
Let's rewind just a little bit. So after you guys moved to Endicott and your mom's working, she's got a new degree and she's working. You said your dad was around a lot. Was he working as well, or was he staying at home, or what was his?
He'd second or third shift usually.
So what was that time in your life like? I think you mentioned you're moving around a lot before you eventually settled around 14.
Well, and that's where I was gonna back up a little, say like that year that I was 14. That was a tough year for the people around me, the family. I was by that point already profoundly messed up. Because when I was 12 years old, I was sexually assaulted. And this was at a summer camp. It was tremendously violent. There was a lot of deliberation to it. It was planned. It was part of a effectively gang initiation of sorts, I guess. I mean, that sounds weird to say outside of Binghamton, New York, because it's not a place people associate with gangs, but that's what he said it was, and I believe that to be true. Yeah, like I say, it was at knife point. I was effectively left for dead, and another one of the gang members came and found me, and he's the one who sort of cleaned me up and bandaged the wounds and drove me home with the warning of, you don't tell anybody. We know where you live. The rapist was I was there as a camper when I was 12 years old, and he was there technically as a camper too, but obviously some paperwork had been falsified or something, because I believe he was actually around 16. And so it was one of those, like, we all knew something was weird, but you don't ask, you know, how do you prove anything?
Yeah, he seemed older.
Yeah, and, some people just do. And it was his friend, for lack of a better term, that came and found me was a counselor at the camp.
Oh, wow.
And so this was very much set up about, like, the assailant came and snuck into my cabin in the middle of the night and said, you have a phone call, something's wrong at home, you have to come with me. And I was at 12, I was pretty trusting still at that point. Too tired to even think, like, this is weird, maybe I shouldn't do the thing. And so there, that was a rough night in many levels. This was also, by the way, a church camp, and so the whole concept of what does God mean and what does it mean to be a good person, and where's your God now? When I'm lying here,
and that happens.
Yeah, I'm lying here bleeding out, and I'm watching the sun come up through the leaves alone. So that was tough, and I came home, and I was frightened to tell my parents. They were, at that time, not yet 30. And there was no real reason to believe that they could have coped with this in a reliable way. Because you go to my dad, and he would have said the right thing, but not knowing what to do. Mm-hmm. You go to my mom, and she would have pressed charges, perhaps, or been invasive in some way, taken me to a doctor, but not in a caring sort of way, but more in an invasive, let's prove this really happened kind of thing. And I didn't feel capable of dealing with either one. So I didn't. Like, I just kept it to myself, and I kept it to myself for a couple of years. So then I'm 14, bad year, bad times. And then my 9th grade year, I was 15 at the end of my 9th grade year, maybe even my 10th grade year. And there was a chorus concert that was happening at a different high school, like a shared event, you know. And so I went to this other high school. We got rides there instead of taking the bus. And I knew that this was the high school that the rapist had attended. And this was the town where he had lived, as far as I knew. And now by this point, I had PTSD for years, untreated. I was anxious all the time, hypervigilant, nightmares, terrors. I was cutting. I was...
From being assaulted at camp?
All of it. Yeah. And not having any of this acknowledged or recognized or treated. And, you know, my parents just sort of looked at me like, just get over it. Just get over whatever is bothering you today. Like, the word drama was big in my house. Don't be so dramatic. We don't need this drama.
And they had no idea what was going on in your head. I
don't think they knew at all, period. And so I went to this chorus concert, and there was someone, we're on stage, the lights are in your face. I'm tall, so I'm in the back row. And I can see in the balcony of this not arena, what's the name I'm looking for?
Yeah, theater.
Auditorium, whatever.
Auditorium.
Yeah, theater. Top row in the way back, there's a man standing with the same skin coloring and the same posture with a hoodie pulled up so I couldn't see his face. And the PTSD blew up. I call it the brain weasels, right? Just started screaming in my head like, that's him. He knows you're here. He's coming to kill you, to hurt you, to rape again, something like I didn't even know. And so right after we get off stage, and I'm hyperventilating and I'm crying and upset, and my then closest friend was like, what is wrong? Because I hadn't even told her, and I did. And her reaction in the moment seemed sympathetic enough, like, I'm going to get you a ride home, blah, blah. But what she did was went and found this guy, who is actually now dead, and so I won't use his name, but a mutual acquaintance. And she told him, Kate needs a ride home because she's upset because she's saying that some guy in the audience assaulted her, raped her. And he was like, well, the guy you're describing is a friend of mine. And she's like, well, then she's blaming your friend for rape. Right? Part of that is teenagers being idiots, all of us being idiots collectively. But there's also a tremendous cruelty streak there.
Yeah.
Of her saying, well, if you never told me about it before, then clearly this never happened.
That's what she said to you?
Later, yeah. But, so all I know is she's saying, here's this guy, get in his car, he's going to drive you home. And so
you're still freaking out.
I've calmed down mostly, especially this guy that's driving me home is a football player. Big, stocky guy, tall, one of the popular kids, so I felt like I had a degree of protection, especially once I was in the car, right? And we got not very far from that end. This was like 15 miles from my home. And maybe we're a mile down the road. We were on the side of the highway, and he pulls over, and I said, well, is there a problem with the car? He says, no, I heard you accused my buddy of raping you, and that's bullshit. I just know he didn't. I know he didn't. And so I think that your way of paying for your ride home will be a blowjob. And I disagreed with that. I was, no, that's no. And he's like, well, then get out of the car. And so I did. And so I walked the rest of the way home.
When he said that to you, were you scared or angry or all of it?
I was terrified. I was terrified. But I have never been one I'm not compliant. I had learned, that's something that I had learned from my mother from way back, is that you put on a show, you put on that shell, that bravado, that you can't make me attitude, even if I'm dying inside, And so saying to him, like, no, I'm not going to do this. If he had a weapon, I absolutely would have. No question. But instead, I got out of the car and I started walking. And so I got home much, much later than my parents expected, and they were angry at me. And I don't know why exactly. This was literally the first time in my life I had been late for curfew. Like, I was a good girl. I was a marching band nerd. I was in chorus, So I wasn't demonstrating, like, a pattern of behavior. But my mother just flew off the handle. Why are you so late? You're not going to leave the house for a month. Grounded, using words like grounded, like I'd never been grounded before. Like I still, now today, I'm 42 and I don't know what that means, and so in the process of this argument, I got angry and I yelled back, like, you don't know anything about me. You don't know what my experience, what my life is like. And she got very belittling and dismissive in a way that she still does now, of like, I think I know plenty. And I'm like, you don't know that I was raped. Where were you for that? If you know so much. And that was not great. Like, that's not a good way for anybody to find things out. It's not a good way for me to feel like I didn't feel like I was in control of sharing this information. They certainly weren't in control of receiving it. So it was just a bad moment. Next day, my parents picked me up from school and took me to a therapist. Like, right away. I don't know, whether this is because it was the early 90s or if my mother pulled strings or whatever. But next day, I had a therapy appointment. And it was an older woman. I still, in my mind, it's E.T. Like, I'm pretty sure that's not actually what she looked like, but, like, she had enormous blue eyes, and that's,
Yeah.
And we get in her office, and I think in retrospect that she was probably doing a practice that's called EMDR. Eye movement desensitization something. No, eye movement rapid, EMRD, eye movement rapid desensitization.
What is it supposed to do?
Effectively, people, and I'm iffy on it myself, because, by the way, spoiler alert, I'm a psychologist. But so I'm not sure. Like, the way I feel about it is, if it works, use it. But I'm not certain on this one. It's kind of like hypnosis. I'm kind of iffy. It's squishy. But basically, the idea is you pick a thing to look at. So often two things to look at. And you look back and forth real quick so that your eyes are moving back and forth. Sometimes also holding something in your hands and controlling your breathing. And you talk through the event. Or sometimes you have talked through it and it's on tape. And, this is back in the days of tape. And they, press play.
Yeah.
And you listen through. Well, so it's sort of like a hypnotic experience or like an immersive experience. The idea of, like, listening through and controlling your breathing, and that is how you convince your body not to freak the fuck out.
And she had you do that?
This was the first session, so no.
Oh.
But I think that was what we were leading up to. And the reason I think that is because we sat, like, literally knee to knee in her office. And she leans in real close. And first of all, she had me looking at a tree outside her window. But then she leans in real close and she's like, look at me. I want you to tell me everything that happened. And I was like, I mean, I'm sorry, but get fucked. Like,
yeah, first meeting. Like,
that's not going to happen to an angry 15-year-old. That's not going to work. I had no reason to trust this woman, anything. So I left the office. Because she was like, well, we're not going to talk about anything else until you tell me about that. So I was like, okay, well, then we're not going to talk about anything else. So a week or two later, my parents took me to another therapist who was much younger and seemed sweet, seemed like a nice girl. And we talked for maybe half an hour, and I was starting to trust her a little bit. I was starting to tell her a little bit about what had gone on. And her answer was to stop me at, like, the halfway point and go, okay, I'm going to go get your parents now so that we can tell them everything you just told me together. no, again, no, that's absolutely not a thing. Absolutely not going to happen, you know? So after that, my mother was like, well, clearly since you didn't engage with these therapists, you're fine. And that was it. That was the last time we talked about it for years, like for another decade or more. We didn't talk about it. And that was just it. That was just became a topic that was not allowed in my house.
At 17?
I was 15.
Is that around 15? So you're 15 and you're just left to deal with it.
Yeah, well, it never even happened. Just scrubbed clean. Yeah. So, I mean, my behavior went off the charts at that point, but in very subversive ways. Like, I used to sneak out of the house. I was jailbait before the internet was a thing. You know, using bulletin board systems and hooking up with much older men and crossing state lines, going to parties. Like, I never drank much, and I didn't have consensual sex, but, you know, or I didn't have full, intercourse anyway. But I otherwise went right up to the line many, many times. Made some really, really bad choices, and I still look back at that like, I don't understand exactly why I survived, you know? So things got bad. Like, I had lost my friends. My best friend that I had told decided to, like I said that, well, since you never told me before, it never happened. You know, that you would have told me if it was a real thing. And so she managed, you know, she went around the school and told everybody that I was lying about this. And so I was mostly barred from most of the friend groups and cliques that I had ever been a part of before. And it got bad. You know, I was cutting, I was miserable, I was absolutely this close from suicidal, like every day. Just I would wake up and be unhappy that I had woken up every single day. And my mother and I, my junior year, my mother took me to a college not open house, but like a fair. You know, a whole bunch of colleges. And at this point, I'm just like, I mean, we can go look, but I'm not going to live that long. Like, I can't do this for another year waiting to get into a college, you know? But there's one college that we came across that had a bridging year program, they call it, where it's not graduating high school early. It's combining my high school senior year with my college freshman year. Because I was down to only 2 classes that I needed to graduate as it was. And so here's that situation of like, my mother didn't know the things to say to help, but she knew how to make it work because the administration of my high school was not on board.
With you doing the program?
Right. And she made that, you know, she was able to sort of steamroll her way through that. So I went to college early. And my second week, I got extraordinarily drunk for the first time in my life on rum, which I still do not drink, and was sexually assaulted again. And this time was a case of what they used to call date rape. Right? It's just rape. Right? But I was not able to consent there, even, you know, arguably, like, I didn't fight, I didn't kick, I didn't necessarily even shout no. But there was no way that I could have consented, you know, in any sort of sober way. And he told me the next day that I should have been grateful because clearly it hurt quite a lot. And so he'd, you know, basically done me a favor.
Wow.
Right?
That's crazy. So you're basically blackout drunk, second week of college, mixed college and a senior year. So you're, what, 17?
Baby. Yeah, 17 years old. So, yeah, the PTSD that was a thing. And my mother made it very clear that I was welcome to go see counselors on campus or at home for any reason. Now, this is about 4 hours away from home. But that she was going to find out, and she would be touching base with them on my progress. That if my parents were going to have to pay for this, they were going to get progress notes. And at the time, I didn't know what my HIPAA rights were. I didn't know how to draw those lines. You know, the one person, you know, my mother could have explained that to me better. She was the one telling me she was going to break them. So I just stayed messed up, you know?
because pretty much your only avenue for care came with strings attached that it was immediately going to be told to your mom and your parents, your mom and your dad.
I believed so, yeah. I actually didn't have a problem with my dad finding out, but my mom, I wasn't comfortable with that.
And were you still living at home when you started your mixed year?
Well, funny you should ask, because that was another message. Like, I got messages that were not spoken to me, such as that I had no rights to privacy. My mother never said those words to me, but that was communicated there. Such as my reality was never as important as her intention. Because if I ever got upset over something she did or said, she would say, well, I didn't mean it that way. And therefore, that wasn't a case of, I didn't mean for you to get upset and I'm sorry about that. It was, I didn't mean it that way, so you don't get to be upset.
You're taking it the wrong way.
Exactly. And, so my whole life, that was the case, that her intention was more important than my reception, the results to me. And so I learned here that I can't, trust is hard, privacy is hard, safety is not a thing in the world. I had no idea how to engage in healthy, safe relationships with partners. And I had partners of both genders, and I just had no idea how to navigate boundaries or how to any of that. Like I was flailing, And I came home. So I went to college. I was 17 years old. I went to college end of August and went 4 hours away. I went back home for the October break, right? I walk in the door and go downstairs to where my room was. Like, it was a split-level ranch, so 3 bedrooms. Upstairs, my parents, each of my sisters, right? It used to be my parents, my sisters shared a room and an office, right? And I had a bedroom in the basement. I go downstairs to my bedroom, and it is not my bedroom anymore.
Whoa.
They have moved my sister down into there, so now it's my parents, my sisters in an office upstairs, and my other sister in the basement. And they're like, you can sleep on the couch.
Where was all your stuff?
In storage, mostly, or my sister just used it.
Wow.
A lot of it got thrown out, presumably. I don't know.
Welcome home.
Yeah, that's the thing. At 17, I really didn't have home. And so there's another message that has been demonstrated to me without speaking of, you don't have a place here. So college was me getting, I finished up my freshman year, but then not too long into my sophomore year, I got an apartment off campus. So at 18 years old, I signed my first lease. I had a car and was doing my thing.
What were you studying?
I started off studying mechanical engineering. And I did that for 2.5 years. And then my junior year, I got very sick with a kidney infection. I seem to be somewhat, not prone to, but like every 5 or 10 years I get one. That's real bad. And that was this. So I was in the hospital for a week and a half, and it was the first time that I had slowed down since starting school. Because when I was home on breaks, I was working 40-hour weeks at IBM in order to save up enough money to go back to school and, eat and stuff.
What were you doing there?
At IBM, I worked on their help desk. And then I would go up to school, and I worked part-time as a photographer with the news department. And I was taking a heavy overload of classes. For a while, I was both engineering and management major. And now suddenly I'm in the hospital, and I slow down, and I look around, and I realize everybody's unhappy. Like, I was unhappy. Everybody's unhappy. But, you kind of blame it on its engineers, sort of stereotypically. And they're sort of a dour bunch. And where this was in the country, it starts snowing before Halloween and continues snowing after Mother's Day every year.
Where was it?
Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York. So it's up on the Canadian border. The closest cities are Montreal and Ottawa. So that's, people ask me, they'll notice that I have a little bit of a Canadian accent. That's why. Right. It's because of that. And
Picked up at school.
I did. And so and sorry, like I know it's there. I can't not,
yeah.
you know. So, somebody brought me the book Mindhunter, which is the book that, this is in, 94 or so, but that's the book that the Netflix series is based on. And I read it and I was like, I could do this. This is fascinating. I get it. I get what he's saying. I could do this. And he seems to like his job. What a concept. It's not about being dark all year or being around engineers. It's that I don't fit here. That the idea of engineering is you get a bunch of people in a room and you give them the same variables and they plug away and they all come out with the same answer. And that answer is either correct or incorrect. And that's it. And with psychology, you get 30 people in a room and you tell them, draw a house. And they'll all draw a house and then you'll get 30 different ones and they are all correct. How magical and complicated and messy is that? Like, I loved it. I loved the challenge of people. So I dropped all of my engineering classes and I picked up only psych from there. And I ended up graduating as the only psychology major in my graduating class.
So what is the idea behind Mindhunter and what attracted you to it? Like, what did you latch on to and say, that's what I want to do?
I liked the idea of being able to understand somebody based on little cues and tips they had left behind. I liked the idea of working within law enforcement, but not being a cop. And I don't even know exactly on that because I didn't have a whole ton in the way of direct connection with the criminal justice system, but I was certainly aware that there were a lot of problems. And I felt like harsher punishments and, longer sentences, that's not the answer, that there's got to be some other answer. And I liked this idea that the way, Mindhunter is about FBI profilers talking with serial killers to figure out how they had done their thing in order to help them go out and find other serial killers. And so I didn't necessarily want to do that, although I did eventually later on interview with the FBI. I decided I did not want to do profiling specifically because for one, it's so statistics-based and there's a lot of racial profiling involved, and also you're getting your information from failed serial killers, from the ones that got caught. Right? And so you can't really get information from a successful ongoing serial killer because you have to kind of arrest him, right? Plus, right. I'm not okay with traveling 48 weeks out of the year, which is what you do. You are on call all the time. Makes sense, right? I'm also not okay with carrying a gun or having a gun in my home. It was just, I didn't have children at this point, but I planned to. And that wasn't the family life I wanted. So I went from there to I went to Suffolk University in Boston, Massachusetts to get dual degrees I have a master's in criminal justice and I have a master's in mental health counseling. And I did, at that time, I interviewed with the FBI and chose not to. And one of my professors was a forensic psychologist. And he was like, you could do this instead. And forensic psych is working with people after they've been caught. So maybe getting a diagnosis, maybe figuring out whether they are competent to stand trial, maybe figuring out, sometimes it's also contentious custody evaluations where you do that, it's all assessment rather than therapy. And it's this idea of how do you get inside this person's head and figure out how they see the world? And I thought that was so cool.
After you graduated with the psych degree, how did you determine I'm going to go to Suffolk and I'm going to do these other two degrees? Like what was the transition between graduating with the psych degree and then determining I'm going to go do these two master's degrees and I'm going to go do it in Suffolk?
Well, I switched from I was still at Clarkson, but it was my junior year that I switched over as a psych major. And so after a semester of that, I was already happier than I had been at any time doing engineering. And then my senior year, I had an internship at a psych hospital in Ogdensburg, New York, which is like literally the bridge to Canada. One of its supports is on the grounds of the Ogdensburg Psych Hospital. Right. And so that's where it is. It's like up way north there. And I loved it. I love dealing with, these weren't freaks. They weren't diagnoses. They were people that were surviving with some weird shit going on in their head. And at that age, you're not allowed to do a whole lot in terms of, therapeutically or intervention, which is good. Like, by all means, at 20, I'm not ready to do that anyway. But that meant that basically what I would do is I would like sort of organize charts or that kind of thing. Or they would tell me like, just go sit in the day room, just go talk to people, get to know who they are and what their life is like. And that is probably one of the most powerful training tools that I walked away with. In any subsequent place that I worked, I would try and find time to just sit with the clients in a non-active clinical sense and just explain to me like, okay, you have schizophrenia. What does that mean? What is that like? Does it hurt? When you hear voices, what does that mean? Does it sound like they're coming from outside your body? Does it sound like they're in your head? Are they speaking to you or about you or nothing at all to do with you? When you're getting messages from the television, is it only on certain channels or all? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, really asking them, like, what do you mean? What does depression mean? Does it mean you're just really sad all the time? And so on. And hearing it from the person rather than from a professor or a doctor or a book, that's where it's at as far as I'm concerned.
And was it working with these people that helped you realize you wanted to do the master's in mental health? Or
I'm just going to keep doing the thing. I didn't want a master's only in criminal justice because I didn't want to be a cop. And I didn't want to be a politician. And often those were the people in the classes. And I also didn't want to be I wasn't looking to change the world in a sociological level. Like sociology is systems and psychology is people. So they both kind of have a lot of overlap, but I wanted to work one at a time, not from the top down, but one person at a time. So I also took on mental health counseling to give me more skills in terms of how to work with the people that are creating this criminal justice system. And at Suffolk, it's a joint degree program, so I could get two-year degrees in a span of 3 years. Right? Because they let you share.
It's a good deal.
Yeah, it let me shave another year off. So now I actually graduated with both master's degrees at the same time. I was 22 years old.
And how did you choose Suffolk? I mean, did they have a relationship with your college in New York?
No, I just got in.
Okay. That works.
I mean, I got into a couple other places too, including a couple of doctoral programs, but I wasn't ready to dive in and commit to a doctoral program at that moment.
Sure.
So also at the same time, 22, so I'm my third year of grad school, I got pregnant. My husband and I have now been together 19 years, so same guy from college, go figure.
And did you meet him in New York?
Yeah, he was my bartender.
Oh, okay.
Through my undergrad.
In your undergrad.
Because I graduated my undergrad when I was 20 years old, so you need an in,
Mm-hmm.
And trust was an issue. There was a history of infidelity when we were dating, and so at the time that I moved to Boston, we had broken up. And we were separated for several months. And then I had this realization of I hate what he did, but I love this guy. I was mad. I was so angry. But, okay. We had this long phone call that was look, we're going to talk this through once. Meaning I felt the need to know names and time frames and dates or whatever. And then I never wanted to talk about it again.
And that happened while you were in Boston and he was in New York.
Actually, I made him, I dumped him by making him drive down to Boston to see me and dumping him and making him drive back. So there's that. But yeah, the call happened then while I was in Boston and he was in New York, and saying like, look, I'm willing to try this again. And he seemed pretty interested. And so that's what happened is we had that phone call of, here's your ultimatum. Here's your bottom line. Does that seem like something you can do? Does that seem reasonable? Because if the answer is no, like, no harm, no foul, we're done. We're just done. That's fine. And he felt like, yeah, that was something he could do. And like I said, we've been married 19 years. No, it has not been smooth sailing. I don't want it to sound like, oh, poof, we've been married 19 years, all good.
Of course. So did he stay in New York after the call, or did he just immediately move down and join you in Boston?
He had to finish his master's degree.
Okay.
He was he's a math major, and he was getting his master's degree in math at the time. And so he moved down like 6 months after that phone call, and I got pregnant not long after that. And, we decided to keep the baby and we're going to make a go of this. But like, I refused to get married, even though we were already engaged by that point. But I was like, I won't get married. I can't need you. This whole trust thing, like it's been a problem for my whole life. And this whole relying and believing on my own experiences and my own, that my own feelings were valid and my own reactions had value. That was super new to me. And I was like, I can't, like, if I marry you too quickly, I'm going to abandon all that and I'm going to lose a part of my soul. And also at the same time, when I got the positive pregnancy test, when I was done freaking out, and hyperventilating and losing my shit, that's the first time I put myself in therapy. Mm-hmm. And didn't tell my parents, just now I'm going to work on this for the first time ever through my grad school's student health center, because I had to be in a better mental space to be a good mother. This kid deserved better than a mother who could not sleep through the night, who had screaming nightmares, who I could not be outdoors if sunlight was coming in through the leaves. Who would fall into the memories of PTSD are different. They're very much more immediate and they're tactile. They're your whole body at the same time. And you can't stop it. Like once you fall into remembering what that night is like, you can't just turn it off. Like right now, if you, hopefully this is not a traumatic moment for you, but like you can think about your second grade teacher. And then you can stop and you can think about your favorite candy bar, right? Or whatever. Like you can bounce around things in your head. A PTSD memory, a trauma memory, once it starts, it's just gonna roll. And you're along for the ride. And you feel it and you smell it and you hear it. And it's a much more immediate, much more visceral thing. You are in the movie until it's done. And then when it's done, you're wrecked all over again.
Wow.
And yeah, I don't recommend it. Like, not fun. And so I was like, I can't be a good mother and feel like this all the time. So I started therapy for the first time, and it was just, just visual quotes, right? It was just talk therapy. Like, there was no special technique involved, no trend, no hypnosis, nothing like that. It was just, let's talk this through. Let's find out what's difficult for you and focus on that.
That was the second year of your graduate study?
My third year.
Third year.
Yeah.
So you got pregnant, you started therapy, and you finished your degree, and then you have your first child?
She was actually born, the little jerk was born 4 weeks early. 5 weeks early, sorry. So she was supposed to be born in mid to late May after all of my papers were written and turned in, and I'd be done. And instead, she comes along 5 weeks early, and so I ended up typing 3 of my final papers one-handed while breastfeeding.
Wow.
Because what are you going to do, right? Like, I'm not going to let go of my entire semester, and it's not going to get easier, like, right away, because it doesn't. With sleep deprivation, it's not like, oh, in 2 weeks it'll be fine. So that's what we did. And I mean, I guarantee that my professors were like, okay, okay, good enough, pass, go. So that was my master's degree, and I took a year off after she was born. I still feel like that was one of the most feminist decisions that I ever made in my life, to stay home and raise the kid, because I chose it. And that to me is what feminism is about choosing what you want to do and how you want to structure your life. And then I decided, well, in order to do the job I really want, in order to be a forensic psychologist, like my professor who I had for more than one class. So when I had the existential crisis of like, oh my God, I'm not going to go into the FBI. What am I going to do instead? He was like, why don't you do this? And his suggestion to me was get a plain old garden variety doctorate in clinical psychology. Don't get a doctorate in forensic psychology. Don't even specialize. Just clinical psychology, because that is the most flexible degree you can get in the field, right? And then that way, 5 years down the road, you change your mind. You don't have to go back and start from square one. You can use this core degree to do a whole lot more. But if you have a forensic psychology degree, you can't necessarily go on and do school psychology later on, depending on the school district, right? So I was like, okay, that's what I did is I spent that year off in between breastfeeding and getting married. I also applied to grad school, and I got into a grad school in New Hampshire. And so we bought our first house and moved in August of 2001. And then
in New Hampshire?
Yep. And then September 11th happened, and bang, right? But the thing is, the reason September 11th was relevant to me was that my husband and I had a whole lot of conversation and go around and difficulties around, do we remain in Boston where there are more jobs for him and I commute? Because it's sort of set up as a commuter school. So all of the classes are on Mondays or Tuesdays. So like that's possible, but it means leaving my baby and my husband down in Boston 2 or 3 days a week. And the cost of living is so much higher in Boston. Or do we move up to New Hampshire? My husband had gotten a job offer as a high school teacher, which he never wanted to do, but with a master's in math, it's one of the things you can do. And buy a house and live there in this little town for 4 years. And that's ultimately, we had to basically budget it down to what is the most cost-effective decision, and it was that. And so that's what we did. And so when September 11th happened, we were all within a mile of each other in this little tiny town. And so we were able to sit and watch it happen on TV. It happened. It was actually my second day of classes that it happened. And we were all sent home, and you watch TV safely here together because they're not going to attack New Hampshire.
You said for 4 years. Was that the length of your doctoral program, or why was it 4?
That's what it is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it was the length of the program.
Yep. And then initially I thought we were going to stay for 5 years because you have to do a 1-year postdoctoral internship somewhere. But my husband got really antsy about not wanting to teach another year of high school, and he really wanted to start his doctorate in math. And ultimately I agreed, which effectively meant I walked away from that final postdoc internship experience, because I was going to have to, for all of the internships I was looking at were going to be now 2 or 3 hours from home. So it's a tremendous difficulty in the commute and in the balance, work-life balance. And we were going to be moving to a new area. My daughter was about to start kindergarten. My second child, my son, was about a year old at the time, and I was like, this is too much. I cannot do all of this. And so what I let go was that internship year.
And does that affect your degree, or does that not?
Some, I did finish all of my, comprehensive exams for my doctorate, but it means there are some states I couldn't get some jobs in. that was hard. That was hard to walk away, to feel like it's not quite finished, it's not quite completed. And that's a matter of which school I went to, too. There are schools that don't require a postdoc internship. So that was a real tough time. My husband and I went through a lot of rocky times in those first several years, of me kind of holding my distance from him. And then there was a lot of resentment around feeling like we were prioritizing his work, his wishes over mine, and that kind of thing. And it sort of, we were quite a ways in. Plus, his mother was quite toxic, and my parents weren't great. And so there was a lot of us figuring out things all on our own and dealing with a lot of family drama and trying to navigate what we could.
You said the first couple years, did it change? Was there like a turning point where it got less rocky because something happened?
Yeah, there's always, to me, in my life, there's always moments. There's always watershed moments. And the first big one that sort of solidified our marriage, I think, was in 2003. So we'd been married for 3 years. Our daughter was 3 years old. And I was pregnant, and I had a second trimester loss. I've never quite known whether to call it a miscarriage or a stillbirth. It is not, we never held the child. I got in a car accident, which should have been significantly worse than it was. I was T-boned at an intersection by a semi that was hauling telephone poles. But I saw it coming, and I was able to accelerate, so it just caught the rear quarter panel of my car. And so I kind of spun out in the intersection, but the car was still drivable.
Wow.
Right? And, I obviously fell to pieces at the side of the road, but I was fine physically. But still, I went to see my doctor the next day, and I was fine, and there was no heartbeat. And it's never been entirely clear to me whether the accident caused it. Probably not. Probably there's something went wrong previously, and we just discovered it at the time because of this. But, frankly, it really doesn't matter. Like, by this point, everybody thinks of me as being 5 months pregnant. And everybody knew, everybody could see that I was one day, effectively visibly pregnant, and the next day not, as far as they were concerned. I actually spent 3 weeks waiting to see if my body was going to figure it out on its own, knowing that I'm carrying around, a dead baby.
Yeah.
You know, and trying still to be a happy mommy to my 3-year-old. And just, man, that was not a good time. Not a good time, those 3 weeks. And I ended up having a procedure to end the pregnancy because I was like, I cannot do this anymore. And so from what I understand, there is a grave marker somewhere in like a memory garden. It's not a formal cemetery in this hospital in New Hampshire, but I've never visited. We never opted to find out the gender, and we opted not to name because we didn't pick out the name. We never found out the gender of any of our kids until birth, and so we never gave any of our kids a name until birth, and so the same with this one. But that was not cool. And my husband, true to form, my mother came out to get shit done. Like, she got me to the procedure, and she drove me home, and she took care of things around the house until you're not allowed to drive for like 2 days or whatever it is afterward. And as soon as they were sure that I wasn't going to bleed or wait for the anesthesia to burn off or whatever it was. But whenever that arbitrary or medical third day happened, my mother was like, okay, see you, bye, going home.
Wow.
Okay, fair, fine. We didn't get along all that well. We didn't argue. It was always tense. It was always uncomfortable. And so when she left, my husband and I are kind of sitting looking at each other like, what was that? And he kicked into gear. And it's the first time that I really let another person care for me and trusted that he was going to care for me. And he went and bought chocolates and ice cream and went and got a bunch of chick flicks, to watch. And this is back on DVD, right? And that kind of, may have been VHS. I don't know. But, there was a specific moment that I knew okay, this could be okay. And it was when he rented a movie that featured pregnancy loss. Like, the movie wasn't about that at all. And it was almost like a side note. It wasn't a main plot point. But it happened, and my husband paused the movie, and he was so upset with himself, and he apologized, and he's like pacing around and just so angry because he was like working so hard, trying so hard to do a thing. And yet, here's this. I mean, I was actually okay. Like, I didn't even identify all that strongly with the moment in the film, but seeing how upset he was, I was like, this guy is working really, really hard. And I have to give in and unclench and lean harder, because we can't continue. Like, we weren't arguing all the time, or we weren't different, but it's like, how long can you continue living in parallel with someone, when your lives are inextricably entwined? So that was a big moment.
And this is when you were in New Hampshire finishing up your doctorate.
Yep. And then the decision to prioritize his doctorate over mine, while I did resent that in a lot of ways, it was also another big moment of sort of me giving.
So did you move out of New Hampshire then, or did you?
Across New Hampshire. So about New Hampshire is wider at the base and narrower at the top, and so where we live, we basically moved from one corner at the bottom across like 3 hours to the other corner. And I took another year off because I got pregnant shortly afterwards, and I had my son, and I took a year off for that. And then after that, we got him in daycare. My daughter started, first grade by that point. And that's when I started working at the prison.
The prison, wow.
And that's when I started using all this degree stuff that I'd done, all this classroom stuff and all this internship stuff that I'd done. And I loved it. Like, that's still probably one of the safest and most respected positions I ever held.
What was the job?
I was it's like MH2 or something is what they call it. It's just a mental health worker, is what they call it. But, it had a degree of, like, I don't remember now, like, it had some acronym or whatever, but it basically was about, my job was I did a brief assessment with an incoming prisoner to get their baseline sort of psych history and social history, and do some background research to make sure that they weren't bullshitting me. Because especially just things like people coming in, like, everybody wants Adderall, right? And so confirming if they say, yeah, I have ADHD, like doing some work to confirm, like, do they really, between testing and calling their doctor and things like that.
Right.
And I also did rounds in they call it the SHU, the Secure Housing Unit. Solitary, which is not dark. In fact, it's never dark. 24/7. The lights are on. It's long hallways, long corridors, like, I want to say 10 or 12 cells on a side in 2 or 3 levels. And you walk all the way down one and all the way down the other, because you have to go door to door and ask them, do you need any mental health services today? Because they can't come to me. They're locked down. And they almost always said no. But you still have to offer it. And you have to check in. Therapy is not a thing in prison in the same way. And it shouldn't be. To do outpatient therapy, which I've done, I can do it. I don't like it. I'm not good at it because I don't have the patience. Like, to do outpatient therapy, you basically get inside somebody's head. You learn who they are. You get to know them. You get in their head to figure out how it is they're seeing the world in order to figure out healthier ways for them to see the world. Then you back out and you start offering those suggestions, or you start guiding them in these ways to do it better. But they have to do the work. Because, anybody can sit there and be like, well, just leave the bastard. Just eat less.
Right.
Just stop shooting up. It's not like that. They know. It's that they don't know how. And if the solution doesn't come from within, they're not going to sustain it. Right? So you have to have this tremendous patience, and I just don't. I just don't. So in prison, it's about anger management or coping with anxiety. Like, those were the 2 big things. And I can do that. Like, that's very practical, and it's very surface, because the reason, like, both because that's what they're asking for, but also because you don't want to break somebody down. Like, when you leave a therapy appointment outside, you should walk out feeling like you just, like, you know how you feel after a hard workout at the gym? That's what your brain should feel like. You should feel shaky, you know, and tired a little bit, and like, holy, what's that, right? Because you're working. You're working your brain muscles, you know?
It's an active experience. It's not a passive.
Right? You're not just laying on a couch. Like, you're working.
Yeah.
It's hard work, and you should feel tired, and you should crash that night. You should cry and drink some water and crash. But it's just another muscle. And in prison, you can't do that to I'm going to say a man because that's where I worked, right? But you can't do that to a prisoner, because they can't just go back to their cell and isolate until they feel better. They can't go surround themselves with comfort food and a blanket or water or mindless TV. You know, they're going to walk across the rec yard with a sign on their back that says, "I'm vulnerable, please kick my ass." Right? So
yeah.
Instead, you have to keep it very surface. And I learned this, actually, one of my first or second weeks there. One of the first times that I was alone with somebody. Like, on the outside. Even though I know your name, when you come in to see me, see a therapist for the first time, I'm still going to ask you. Tell me your name. What would you like to be called? Right? And even in, like, hospital settings or wherever, where it's like, I have your chart, I know your name, I'm still going to ask. It's a politeness thing, but it's also, like, giving you a little bit of control, giving you a little bit of power here, and allowing us to start engaging at a level where it feels like a more equal playing field. It's not me over you. It's just, let's work through this together, right? And you tell me, you correct me on things. And so I'm sitting down with this guy who was approximately the size of a refrigerator, I swear. Like, he was just, I mean, I'm 5'8", you know, and I'm not a little girl, right? Like, I've always been a bigger girl. And so, and my husband is 6'4", and so I'm used to being around tall people, you know, whatever. And in my memory, this guy was approximately, I don't know, 8'2". Like, he wasn't. But, you know, like, it was the moment of being alone in the room with somebody who was shackled and effectively tied to a chair, like, by his ankles, but still. And he's in the prison uniform, and he's pissed off at being there. And I don't remember what the referral question is. I avoid jargon as much as I can, you know, in my daily life as well as I did in my work. But referral question, meaning, like, all assessment, any assessment, and most therapy is basically, there's a fundamental question that you need to boil it down to. What question am I trying to answer here? And I don't remember what his was. But I start by, you know, in the prison, you start by confirming, is this your number? 6 digits or whatever it was. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 24601, right? For Les Mis fans, is this your number? And he says, yeah. And I said, okay. So it says that your name is whatever, Joseph. Do you prefer Joseph or Joe? Expecting him to answer. And instead he started to cry. Because nobody had said his name out loud to him in however many years it was, 5 years or something, since he'd entered the prison system.
Wow.
Because we strip prisoners of all of their humanity immediately. You are not your first name, you are not your last name, you are a number, and now you're just a barcode on your bracelet. Like, that's how guards can cope with doing their jobs. That's how guards can cope with doing a fundamentally inhumane thing to people, right? Is to take your name, take your personhood away. And now I'm suddenly asking him, what do you prefer to be called? And that single question broke him. And to realize, like, I have to step way out of the earthy, crunchy therapist-y mindset, and I have to keep it down to business, because I can't do this to people. You know, that's cruel of me. You know, even if it feels nice in the moment.
Right.
Bigger picture, that's cruel.
Because of where he's going to go back to.
Exactly. So that was a tremendously fascinating job, and I loved it. And I only left it because it got harder and harder to juggle schedules with my husband. And so I needed a shorter commute, and I needed to be in a job that let me work nights and weekends.
How long did you stay there for?
A couple years. 2 or 3. I don't remember. A while. And then I moved from there to doing crisis work, which is primarily, especially at that time, was in the emergency room whenever someone shows up with suicidal, homicidal thoughts or intentions or actions, or a psychotic break, a manic episode. Sometimes it depends on the state. So not in New Hampshire, but yes, in Massachusetts, also substance abuse concerns. And basically they go through a medical clearance process to make sure that their symptoms are not being caused by any sort of infection or whatever. Make sure that they're not intoxicated at the time, because you couldn't speak to somebody who's intoxicated, because they have to be able to consent. And they have to be able to know what you're asking, and you have to be able to a degree, like, this is not criminal, it's civil, but you're prepared to go to court to use their words. And by this point, I had worked under a forensic psychologist in a state hospital. Previously, I had worked in the prison. I had spent a lot of time in court. And in New Hampshire, you have even more time in court as a crisis clinician, because if you involuntarily admit somebody, then you have to go and speak in front of the judge and explain what the situation was.
So at this time you were in your mid-20s or like late 20s?
Yeah, mid-late 20s, yeah.
You had your daughter and your son, and your husband was finishing his degree. Mm-hmm. What happened next? Why did you not stay? I'm assuming you didn't stay at the crisis center?
Well, kind of. Well, I first what happened is I got laid off as the newest employee as they were restructuring. Then my husband got a job in Boston the following summer. And so we moved from New Hampshire to Massachusetts.
Back to Boston.
Yeah, the day the movers showed up, I found out I was pregnant with my third child. Surprise, know? And so, and by this point, my husband and I were a pretty solid team. We had learned how to work together. We learned how to trust each other. Of course, there's still drama. We had all effectively walked away from his mother by this point, who was textbook passive aggressive. And when I say textbook, I mean, I had a blog that is still out there somewhere if people find it. And I would write, it's just a mommy blog, in a lot of ways, but I also wrote about my mother-in-law. And I got an email from someone who worked at A&E because they did a series called Mother-in-Laws from Hell. That's the level we're talking at, right? It was not good. It was not good. And so we had effectively walked away from her, and he and I had really formed a unit, and we parent a little differently than a lot of the other mommies around. On the one hand, I'm more strict. I'm big on boundaries and rules, and consent is super important to me. Privacy is important to me. But at the same time, I'm mom, your kid. We're not friends. That being said, I'm also more accessible to my kids and very open with them about, you can talk to me about anything. The only thing you will get in trouble with me for is lying. I don't ground my kids. We try to do natural consequences for things. All of that. Let's just, I breastfed. It's called baby wearing, right? The slings and stuff. I did that all in the early 2000s when it was weird to do. But I really bought into the idea of attachment parenting, letting the kid touch you whenever they need to touch you and not touching them if they don't want to be touched. All of that was super important to me.
Yeah, you say when it was weird because now it's probably, I think it's making kind of a resurgence, right? Yeah.
Oh, it's everywhere. Now it's everywhere. Everybody gets a sling when a new baby is born, and you are shamed if you don't breastfeed. So it's interesting having kids 5 years apart because things change a lot in just a 5-year span. And then it was the next 5, so my daughter was 10, my first son was 5, and then I had my next kid.
And that was down in Boston again. So you moved from New Hampshire, you got laid off, you moved from New Hampshire the next year,
yep.
back down to Boston, and then
And I chose to stay home. Like, I chose not to get a job because I knew I was going to be taking time off anyway. And that's when things got weird in my life, in my health. And it's a whole long story that I won't go into detail for purposes of timing. But the bottom line is that I almost died in childbirth.
With your third child?
Yes.
Wow.
He's almost 10 now. But so this was March 2010. Somebody in the delivery room had strep throat. That got into my bloodstream vaginally. So it was a vaginal birth. A little tiny tear, like no surgery, no stitches needed. But that was enough to infect my bloodstream. But I don't tend to spike fevers very often. Plus, my body temp sits around 97 as baseline. So, you know, a body temperature of 95 for me is the same as like 100.5 for other people, or 99 rather. A body temp of 99 for me is the same as like 100.5 for normal people, right? So I was running a temp, but it wasn't high enough for them to be alarmed by it. And so I was ignored for 3 days and I was discharged. They're like, look, you're supposed to hurt after birth. And I'm like, no, not like this. Like, I couldn't breathe or walk or stand or sit or function, and I wouldn't touch my baby, which as an attachment parent, like, that was super weird. There's like 3 pictures of me holding him. And then I was like, you know, like literally it's like, okay, I'll touch him. Okay, you're done with the picture. Take him. Like, there's something wrong with me. I'm sick. I don't want to get the baby sick. And they discharged me without a medical exam, just saying like, look, you're fine. Like, you're fine. And I went directly to the ER pretty much because we tried to drive home and I could not. We lived in a 2nd floor walk up and I couldn't do the steps. I was like, I can't get into the house. And so we went to the emergency room, and that is when we discovered that the pain I was experiencing was not, as I was told, gas pain, but actually my uterus had ruptured.
Jesus.
Ruptured. Right leg. I mean, gas pain, ruptured organ. Totally the same.
And they send you home.
And so I ended up, because it had been 3 days now, that had become inflamed, and I had a secondary infection of necrotizing fasciitis, which is the flesh-eating bacteria you read about in tabloids. And also sepsis, which is when your blood gets infected. So they airlifted me to Mass General. I spent 10 days in a coma. And when I came out of the coma, everything's different now. Like, I had open surgical wounds that took 9 months to heal. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks, and I only went home because I effectively staged a coup. Like, I am going home today because I needed to be home in time for my daughter's birthday. That I was on home health care means you cannot leave the house for that 9 months. I had forgotten how to speak. Forgotten is a simplified word, but like word aphasia, it's called, when you can't find the word, which is still, my speech is a little bit halting and difficult because I'm always scanning for the words. Like, I used to be tremendously more articulate than I am now in terms of just smoothness of speech. I forgot how to handwrite, so I had to relearn that. I was completely unable to bear my own weight, like only 10 days in a coma, and I could not get from bed to chair. And I was pretty strong before then. And so everything changed, you know, and I spent that first year home because of physical recovery. And then at the end of that, they were like, okay, you're good. Like, this is as good as you're going to get. And that is when I fell apart emotionally, because up until then, it's like, of course I'm upset. I'm sick. Look, I'm sick. Like, of course I'm upset. And then they're like, yeah, but you're not sick anymore. And I was like, oh, but I'm a mess. And so I had a suicide attempt on Thanksgiving night of 2010. Not really a full attempt. Like, I started the process, and then I thought about my kids, and I was like, I don't want to be alive anymore. I don't want to hurt like this every single day. I don't want to be confused all the time. I was hopped up on the literally highest doses of opiates allowable. You know, maximum human dosage. And so I was confused all the time, and I would nod out. I couldn't be alone, like, by my choice. I couldn't be alone with my kids because I didn't know what my stamina was going to be. So we had hired a nanny. this is not me. This is not my life anymore. And so I was ready to end it. But I looked at my kids and I was like, you know, they need mom sitting on the couch, even if it's not me. Like, they need the pretense. So I told my husband, and he brought me to the emergency room, and I was admitted to the psych unit, and it was awful. It was awful. Like, I was first of all, I was, you know, being on the other side of the bed when I used to work, admitting, like, that was awkward, right? And luckily, like, I never worked down here then, but still, like, knowing the process, and I knew exactly what words to say and not to say, and I was just like, I'm not going to engage in the rest of the process. Like, here's the bottom line, and I'm not going, like, let's just make this easy, you know. And so I was admitted, and you are locked in, and you are alone, but you're not allowed to stay in your room. You know, you have to sit in the day room and be, like, fake sociable with these people that they're perfectly lovely and beautiful people, but you're not going to maintain a friendship outside. And, you know, having, like, my father came down to visit. My parents by this point had split, and he had his second wife with him, and they came down and they're like, what happened? And they're looking at me like I was broken. And my mother was like, we're never going to talk about this to anybody. And she never talked about it to me. She never came out when I was in the hospital then, because that wasn't a real sickness. Like, she came out when I was in the coma. She shuttered up her house. She kenneled her dog. She put her business on hold, and she came out and ran my household for 6 weeks. And we will always be grateful for that. Like, she did the things that we needed to do. But as soon as I was home and had my feet under me, she left. You know, because that's her style. And so when I was in the psych hospital, I was in for almost a week, and she never came to see me. Because that wasn't real sickness to her. That was when she first, you know, then and a little bit earlier as well, she just started announcing to my sisters, to my husband, to anybody who would listen, that I'd never been raped. I was just, that was where she ended. It just, it never happened.
Out of the blue?
Happened. Pretty much. Like, one time she and my husband were both, like, the first time he heard of it, they were both warming up lunch, and I wasn't home at the time. We were at her house. And she turns and looks at him and she goes, you know this rape thing that Kate talks about? And he's like, yeah. You know, by this point we'd been married like 5 years. So he'd seen the scars. He'd been there for the nightmares and everything. And he's like, yeah, I know. And she's like, it never happened. And then she went back to do her work. And he was left, like, waiting for the microwave to go off. You know what I mean? Like, baffled. And that's always been, like, very much a denial of your reality for hers. So that was tough with my mother, but indicative of how things were going to be. And I always sort of let it go of, that has to be okay. Even she hates me, but she loves my husband. She loves our kids. And so it's good enough. Okay, fine. And that's how things were for the next 8 years. My father had a nasty divorce and other things happen.
With his second wife?
With his second wife. And he needed a place to stay immediately. He was unemployed at the time because he was sick. He was having heart and lung issues. So that he moved in with us, and we thought it was short term. And while he, you know, within that first couple of weeks, she filed for divorce and for a restraining order, which he'd never been violent to her. It was based on a presumed threat. He had bought a gun, and she found that threatening. And initially I was on board with a restraining order because in New Hampshire there's a registry such that if you have a restraining order, you cannot own a gun. And I was like, cool, okay, good. But then she filed to make it permanent instead of just letting the temporary restraining order fade. And that's, at that hearing was when he found out that she had also filed for divorce. And so he stayed with us for 18 months. And through that time, he got sicker and sicker, both physically. He had a heart attack and a stroke within the first 4 months of living with us. It wasn't that he became feeble, it's that he thought he had. Do you know?
Was this after you got out of the psych hospital?
Oh, yeah, well after. I was in the psych hospital in 2010. This is in 2017, 2018.
Oh, okay.
So, like, the next 10 years after the psych hospital were just basically me getting on my feet. I went back to work for a couple of years. I I broke my back in 2014, and so I've been on disability since then. But
you broke your back. Wow. How did that happen?
I have an autoimmune disorder. So I have it's called bamboo spine, ankylosing spondylitis. So I have a very thin sheath of bone that grows from the tailbone up and connects the vertebrae and like fuses them. So it looks like a bamboo sprout, right?
Okay.
And that sheath of bone that forms is super brittle, and you can break it just, in my case, I just stepped wrong on a playground and it snapped. But so I went back to work until that happened, and then I've been on permanent disability since then. So, we adopted a fourth child, which is this whole other story. Busy household. The child came from a trauma background, so she has a high level of need. She is socially and developmentally delayed in certain ways. She's also very, very bright. So it's tricky to get her services, because the schools want to wait until the kids' grades slide before they help. And so that's tough because she does really well academically, but socially she makes really, really strange and bad decisions.
And did you adopt in 2014 or?
She came to us in 2014. The adoption was finalized in 2015. So every 5 years we end up with a child, even though, so with her, like she's only 2 years younger than, so the kids are right now 19, 15, 9, and 7. Right? So she's close in age to her brother, but she came to us, she joined us 5 years after him. Her adoption date is actually her birth date, which is pretty unusual.
So you had 3 kids, and then you decided to adopt a 4th kid.
We didn't decide.
Okay.
Her mother is our former nanny. Sit with that one for a second. Like, she was an excellent nanny, terrible mother. Yeah. So, yeah, we had hoped to be helping to get the mother, like a new start. Come stay with us while you get on your feet and get a new job. And, after life had kind of fallen apart for her. And then it turns out that she was the one who had allowed her life to fall apart, or she had sabotaged it in many ways. And so after 4 months, we told her, you have to leave. And
so you basically saved this, your 4th child. You basically saved her from whatever was going on.
Saved, but we kept her. Like, saved implies that I went out into the world and looked for it. We gave them a safety net, yeah? Mm-hmm. But when we kicked the mother out, we gave her the choice. Like, you can take the baby with you, or you can leave her with us. But you have to go, And she said, I'll leave the baby here because it'll be easier to get a new job, get going that way. And we were like, okay, fine. And 2 weeks later, the biological mother called me and said, I'm never going to get better. You keep her.
It sounds like this person had a lot going on, which is why she said, I need my child to stay with you for a little bit. And then it just never got better.
She thought she was going to be able to play like the fun aunt or something that would be able to come and visit on weekends when she wanted to, but have no actual responsibility. And I was like, you can't do that to this kid. She needs stability in her life. And so either you come on a set schedule with a plan to reunite, or we adopt. And we decide then, based on your behavior, whether you can safely visit. And her reaction was like, well, okay, I'm not ever going to get better. And so we've never seen her since.
Get better, meaning like, I'm not going to get my stuff together.
Yeah, I took my rules for her were that if you want to see the kids, any of the kids, like she had,
because she was your nanny.
Yeah, she had stronger bonds with my older kids in some ways. But I told her 3 things. You have to have a job that involves taxes in some way, a pay stub, like an official, stable job. You have to have an apartment with your name on a lease. And you have to stop engaging in sex work, particularly around the kids. That was it. Those were my rules. And she felt like that was asking too much. So we never saw her again. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. So then you adopted.
Like, we adopted her, and she's been, it's a case of like, she brought a lot of challenges to the household, but we also needed her, and we didn't realize that. She kind of completed the family. It's 2020, which is 5 years after if you're doing the math, we are not having another child in 2020. I want to be really clear about that. Like,
well, it just started, so.
No. Hard no on that one.
Okay.
So my father moved in 2017. At the end, we tried really hard. He tried really hard. He was doing all of the right things. He got on disability. He was seeing a therapist. He was going to group therapy. He was seeing a psychiatrist. But I think he was misdiagnosed. And he felt feeble. Even if he wasn't. He felt broken. He felt lost. And so this past April, 2019, he took a trip to Las Vegas. And he had a series of either migraines or TIAs, mini strokes, or anxiety attacks. It's never been really clear what those were, but I had him in the ER several times after he had a real stroke, like a real big deal, bad, awful stroke right in front of me, which was terrifying. And so I suspect what happened is that when he was in Las Vegas, because he started wanting to go take trips by himself, and he finally got the settlement from the divorce. So he suddenly had money, and he went to Florida, and then he went to Las Vegas, and he was going to go to New Mexico, and he was going to go to, he had this list that he was working through. And so he was on his second trip to Las Vegas, and I got a call the fourth or fifth night that he was there. He hadn't been answering texts. I didn't know what hotel he was in. And I was texting him to just say, which day are you coming home? Because I couldn't remember if it was Friday or Saturday. And I got a call on Thursday night from the Clark County coroner saying, we're sorry to tell you that your father was found dead by suicide. And, there's nothing about that sentence that gets better. My father died by suicide in Las Vegas. Everything about this sucks. And my sisters and I all met in Las Vegas. I still don't actually know how they knew to call me. Must have been in his paperwork somewhere. I don't know. But I was listed as next of kin. So all of the decisions were mine, but my sisters joined me to help out. And they were very supportive and great. My mother and father had divorced 15 years ago, but she wanted to come out too and was very upset when I said no. She was very upset that I didn't include her name in the obituary, but I didn't include his more recent ex-wife in the obituary either. So, it's just one of those, a lot of weird went on, and, had to identify my father, had to claim his remains and his effects and come home. And about 3 weeks later, I was on the phone with my mother. It was Mother's Day of last year. And she started cracking jokes about how she was probably the one with the most recent copy of his will. And about how, I don't remember what the other thing she said, but something about how, he seemed fine at Christmas, but that was always his way. He could always lie. He could always fake it. And then from there it went into, didn't I notice something was wrong? Had I found a note yet? Was I going to destroy a note if I did find one? Why didn't I say anything when he was leaving if I knew something was wrong? I was so sucked into my own stuff that I wouldn't notice. And that my house was toxic to him because he needed peace and quiet, and all I had was kids and chaos. And it's the first time in my life that I ever told my mother, fuck you. We're done. We're done here. And I hung up on her, and I called back a couple hours later after I'd calmed down to be like, look, I apologize for swearing, I apologize for shouting, but do not call me back. Do not contact the kids. We're done. This, all of the other things that you've ever said to me in my life, I keep taking, but there has to be a line. I learned later that she called my daughter about 2 days after this and said all of the same things to my daughter. And that really was sort of the nail in the coffin of, you can say a lot to me and I'll take it, but you don't speak like that to my child. So I lost both of my parents within a month. And I'm still not sure what that does. I'm still wrapping my way around that. I feel very disposable, very leavable. But my husband has been a rock star through this. My friends have been amazing. My sisters have been amazing. Having the podcast has been tremendously important to me. because whenever things get really overwhelming, I come down here and I edit, and it's very detail oriented, and I'm very focused, and I'm not thinking about all of the rest. And on a couple of days ago, I talked to my mother again, because we went to New York and we saw other family, but we did not see her, and it was awkward and stressful. And then she called my husband while we were there, and she went off on this litany of all of the things I had ever done wrong to her, including things like, I didn't get to go to the college I wanted to because I got pregnant. Like her saying those words. And I'm like,
sorry?
Question mark, right? So, yeah, that was a challenge. And so I called her a couple of days ago to be like, look, all I ever needed to hear from you is your feelings are valid. You matter to me. And I love you. And it's not your fault. Can you say those words? And her answer was, well, the reason I said the other things, and I'm like, okay, then we're done. We're done. And I mean, it was a long thing, this long litany of all of the things I've ever done that inconvenienced or upset her. But we're done. And so now it is 2020. And on the one hand, it hurts and it sucks and it's sad and it's scary to be 42 years old and not have either of my parents, and like, what do I do? On the other hand, I'm just grieving now. I don't have that Eeyore cloud of wondering, is today the day that my mother's going to call me? That conversation's done. It's over. And I told her, I severed ties. We're done here. I will figure out my relationships with our other family one-on-one, without her as an intermediary, and we'll go from there. And so I immediately, after that conversation, opened up my computer and I put out an episode. And so that's what I've been doing.
I want to ask you about that. It brings up a good little segue for us. What is it? What episode did you put out? What is it that you're working on? You mentioned a podcast.
Yeah. So my podcast is called Ignorance Was Bliss. Mm-hmm. And it initially was fairly true crime, forensic psychologist and all. Over time, it has merged into something that is more casual, more just tell me your story, because I realized that that's what I loved about assessment, and this is less structured because I'm not walking in with a referral question. It's let's just talk for a little while. Let's see where you're at. Let's see where I'm at. Let's just play. Let's see where things go. And it's super fun. And I've had the opportunity to get to know so many different people. And it's funny because I started the podcast to get away from my father a little bit, because he was sort of this lost soul that would like follow me around the house. And I'd be like, I acknowledge that, but I cannot be your best friend, your therapist, your daughter, your landlord, your all of the things all of the time. Like, I still need to have my own personality in here somewhere. So I'm going to start a show. And then after he died, that is what kept me sane. And it still is, because I don't follow a release schedule. I don't follow a format. I just sort of do. and so that it happened that my last couple of episodes were all very sort of uplifting in their ways. So I spoke with Sarah from Girl in Space, and then Isaiah from the Bird Brain podcast, and then Karen from Y2K, which was, timely. Her first episode was dropped on the 2nd. And so I was trying to sort of put something out as a little bit of a lead time. And all 3 of those episodes are lovely. They're light, and they're hopeful, and they're sweet. And it was really great to be able to go and sit in this happy moment that I had with this other person and focus on that for a little while when the rest of my life was falling apart a little bit.
And this was just a few days ago. Mm-hmm. Where can we listen to your podcast? Where can people find it?
My podcast website is iwbpodcast.com. And I'm at IWB Podcast on Facebook and Twitter and wherever. And I'm online way too much, so I'm around anytime.
Is that, would you say that's like a big thing that you're focusing on now is your podcast? It sounds like it brings you a lot of peace. It gives you a lot of, something to work on and look forward to and pour your energy into.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful hobby because it brings me into contact with people. Like, I spent, between 2010 and 2016, 17, I skipped a lot of the big things that happened in there, but I went through a lot of very difficult medical and emotional issues, and I was in a very dark place for a long time and got very isolated. And so starting the podcast is a way to have this hobby where, here's the thing, I feel relevant again. I feel connected to other people again. I'm using some of that schooling and some of those techniques and training, but not in a conscious way. It's just that people can ask me, like, what does it mean to be not guilty by reason of insanity? Or what is schizophrenia, or whatever. And I know the answers. And so we can include that in the conversation. So the conversations are definitely more intense or more topical or whatever than just sitting on the couch with somebody. But still, so yeah, it's this way of bringing my past into my present and giving me a thing that I can do and giving me a voice again that's just me.
Well, I think that brings us pretty much to today. I appreciate you sharing your story. I want to give you the opportunity to have any kind of a closing thought or any last comment for anyone listening.
Yeah, I guess the most important to me, there's lots I could say, but the most important thing is that I have kind of a catchphrase associated with my show that I don't even say in my show. I need to say it more, and I don't, because it's part of my disclaimer for every episode, which other people read. So it's not actually my voice saying the words. But so my disclaimer is like, this podcast is not safe for work because I swear a lot, and I maintain confidentiality. And if you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Was it 1-800-273-8255-83? I don't know. I don't say it. I'm the one who says it. But the last two words of every disclaimer are, you matter. And I don't think people hear that enough in life. And I don't think we say it enough to people because we don't hear it enough to remember that it has an impact to hear. And so it's worth saying. But you matter, whoever you are. You may not matter to me personally. Like, I may not know you well enough for you to matter to me. But you could if you reached out, and you matter to somebody. And death by suicide hurts so much more. And so it may feel like your pain is overwhelming, or I call them the brain measles that scream in your head, right? That the brain measles may be telling you that everybody will be better off without me. They lie. The brain measles lie. They know where your weak points and your vulnerable spots and the buttons are. They lie. You matter. You are important. And please, every extra day that you stay alive is a gift that you are giving to those around you, even if you don't believe it. So just let it get better.
That's the end of this episode's conversation. If you enjoy this show, please consider suggesting it to a friend and rate us highly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you didn't enjoy the show, let us know how we can improve it at bitesizebiographies.com/feedback. One of my goals as a podcaster is to help you find things you might enjoy. Up next is a promotion from a fellow podcaster. If you enjoy it, why not check out their show? Please note, this is not a paid promotion. It's just an attempt at helping you find a podcast you might enjoy and helping fellow podcasters connect with audiences that enjoy their work.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Up All Night, an Are You Afraid of the Dark podcast. We're your hosts. My name's Cortland.
And I'm Brandon.
And in our podcast, we take apart each episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark, scene by scene, and discuss it in detail. This show is prime early 90s Canadian acting at its best. Or, in some cases, worst. We're here to laugh our way through 7 seasons and 91 episodes. So whether you're a fan of the show...
Think.
That's sourdough. No, mister. Accent on the dough.
Hi, Andy. Won't you come play with me?
Hey, we're just having a goof.
Or experiencing it for the first time.
We know there's nothing better than staying up all night with a scary story.
Bite-Sized Biographies is a passion project created and hosted by me, Corey Thorpe. The inspiration for the podcast came as I listened to a recording of my deceased grandfather and found myself with questions I could no longer ask him. I realized that many people never take the time to tell their story, which means that rich and interesting sagas of life are continually being lost to time. I felt something had to be done to record those stories of life, and bite-sized biographies is my way of telling some of those stories, while simultaneously encouraging you, no matter who you are, to tell your story. Thank you for listening.